Today I'm here to talk about my top 10 science fiction fantasy books that were published before 2025 that I've read so far this year. I know it might seem a little bit early, but I already have 10 solid books to talk about, and I just can't wait to share them all with you, give you some early favorites. Some of these books are definitely going to be on my end of the year content. Some of them may disappear if I have a really strong reading year, but I think I have some great books to highlight again, books that I've reviewed. So if you do want longer form discussion of these books, I do have video wrap-ups that you can go check out. But here are the top 10 books for science fiction fantasy so far this year, not including any new releases. All that being said, let's get started. Starting with science fiction, at the number 5 spot we have Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, which is insane that it's on this list because of the fact that I put out a video last year talking about books I would never read. It's one that I have started and stopped before and never really could get into, and I finally made a commitment this year to try some books that I said I would never try because I think it's really important to push yourself out of your comfort zone, to try different things. And because of that, I ended up with a favorite of the year, a softer favorite. I will admit this one is not necessarily a 5-star read for me, but a soft 4, one that I did enjoy and one I'm definitely thinking about and thinking it's probably time for me to continue on to the later books in anticipation of the 4th book coming out, but I've been told that it keeps getting pushed back in publication, so maybe there isn't a rush there. But if you don't know, this is a sci-fantasy story that follows 2 individuals who are centered to it. There is a swords person as well as a necromancer. They are forced to work together, and it's one of those stories where you have characters that don't necessarily like each other but have to work together, and of course as things progress they start to appreciate each other a little bit more. The story goes on. It is definitely one that is heavier on the fantastical elements given the fact that there is necromancy in the book. It does have that darker element that comes with the subject matter, but at the same time I found this book strangely cozy. It definitely is written to have a little bit of a potential romance going on, and it's just strange and kooky. It's again one that isn't an instant hit for me as I was reading it, but it's one that the more time I spent with the book and then the time I've spent afterwards, it just has lived in my brain, and I am finding myself wanting to go back to the characters, revisit that book again, and again continue on to the later books to see where it goes from there and where it's all going to end up once it all gets published. So definitely a surprise pick for the year for me. Did not expect to see Gideon on this list when I started out the year. Then at number 4 for science fiction, we have Aurora by Kim Stanley Robinson. I just reviewed this book, so I'll try to keep it brief, but essentially it is set on this generational ship where we follow a crew that are not the initial ones that went off on the expedition, but the descendants who are then left to carry out the legacy that was forced upon them, and they had to take it on whether or not they chose it or not, which they did not. And so we follow the crew that is in a lot of ways struggling, and the story is told from the perspective of this young woman, and within the story you see her grow from a child to a woman and how the story for her as well as the wider ship progresses over time. It is one that definitely has some dark and grim moments to it, which for some people might be a turnoff. It may not be the hopeful future of the world that we're looking for, but for me, I have a little bit of a bias these days that I'm feeling very frustrated with humanity. And so because of that, honestly, this book hit right on the money for me. I'm kind of in the mood for something that is a touch pessimistic, and Kim Stanley Robinson, at least the more recent books I've read by him, are really knocking it out of the park. I definitely want to continue going through his backlist because once again, his books just keep landing on my favorites list if you look at these lists year after year. And so I need to keep coming back for more. Highly recommend this one. If you love generational ship stories, this one is definitely one to add to your list. Next up at number 3, we have Nauman by Nick Harkaway, and this is a literary science fiction piece that I talked about earlier this year that in terms of a narrative, it was not the kind of book that I thought I would love as much as I did. This is really a list of surprises here. So this is one that is set in this futuristic society where we have the ability to make our world, particularly our government, incredibly transparent, and so it is provided as potentially something that might look or sound like utopian. However, of course, as the story goes on, there is always an underbelly to anything that seems like progression. There's always the flip side to that. And the story specifically starts out with the fact that something happens to someone in custody and they don't know what happened, and supposedly having true transparency, how could this happen? And it's a story that has a very fragmented narrative in a way. There is so much going on. The book is so ambitious, and that's why I didn't necessarily think I was going to love this book as much as I did, or at least on paper. It's not the kind of book I'm normally drawn to. You hear me talking about my love for tight, short books with very concise narratives that know exactly what they're doing and are making everything feel very purposeful. And not to say that this author did not make his book purposeful, but it is a long book. It at times feels meandering, but his writing is so good, and I just loved going along for the ride. Some of the different discussions that are brought in, and again, the larger picture, the question of this future that kind of leans into my love of something that is somewhat dystopian in nature. It just appealed to me on so many levels, and I had such a good time with it. Despite the length, I read it very quickly just because I didn't want to put it down. I didn't want to read anything else until I had finished it. And again, a book I'm absolutely thinking about. As I talk about it here, I could easily pick it up and read it all again because I'm dying to just revisit that world. And don't get me wrong, it's not necessarily a nice world, but I just got lost in that novel and I kind of want that experience again. Then at number 2, we have The Madness Season by C.S. Friedman. This is the third time I've talked about this book in just a handful of weeks, so I promise I'll keep it super brief for those that are consistently watching my channel. So you know that this one is set in a future where Earth has been conquered by reptilian aliens, and now they're living in that dystopian future. And so within here we have a individual who is a vampire, and specifically the focus of this trait for this individual is the fact that they are immortal. They have this long life, and so they remember Earth as it used to be, and in doing so and being who they are a liability to the future that is trying to control humanity and just wipe out the last of their hope. It's a book that hit me on so many levels. On just a very surface level, I enjoy the vampire aspect, a little bit of the horror pulled in there. You have at the beginning of the story him getting pulled away from the planet, and so you have someone who is being kidnapped or held hostage, and I'm a sucker for that. And then there are just so many layers from there. I love characters that are complex and morally gray, and no one is the perfect knight. Everyone is coming with their own baggage, which is very much shown throughout this one, and I loved where it went. I thought it had a really pleasing ending for my taste, and again, it just hit me at the right time. I was in the right mood, but honestly, I do think that this one is underhyped, as I said in my previous video, and I'd love more people to read it. So again, I pitched it 3 times now. Hopefully this time will hook people in. And for science fiction, my number 1 backlist book of the year so far, but honestly is going to be a really hard one to knock off this top tier, and that of course is Spin by Robert Charles Wilson, a book I have talked about a few times now on my channel. This is again a book that I read and reviewed at least a year or 2 ago, and when I first picked it up, it wasn't what I expected to be. Everyone had touted this book as being one of hard science fiction, and I understand why, but it's also very character driven, and I was not expecting that. And sometimes having a book not meet your expectations, even if you like character driven stories, can really throw off your experience, which is what I think happened for me there. So this is one, if you don't know, that starts out with this group of friends. On this night, they begin the story where the stars go out and they have to figure out what has happened to the sky above them, around them, what is going on in the world. Slowly that is revealed to the children and the world as they have to deal with the new reality of what has happened. And we follow the characters again when they're first young, and there is a coming of age component to the story. The one character has romantic feelings for one of the other individuals. You have these characters who are incredibly smart and getting to see the opportunities that often bring someone who is both smart and also has wealth, and seeing how different characters' trajectories change over the years. It's one that once I knew what I was getting, rereading it, it went from what I believe is a 3-star read the first time around to one of my all-time favorite books. This one will definitely end up on a updated favorites of the year science fiction video. At some point I do need to refilm that video and put out an updated version, but I want to wait to do that once I've changed enough of the picks on there so that it's an interesting list and not just a rehash of my last one. But definitely this one's going to be on there. I loved it so much, the characters, the emotion, and it does still have hard science within it. Really where that comes from when people describe that is how it is taking the world and looking how our world would change if we had to operate with different rules in terms of access to satellites and so forth, and how that would change the trajectory of the world, the different politics, and how the different, again, nations and factions would align or separate. I thought it was fascinating to imagine this future, and again, one that I want to read and reread again. And again, I talked about it in my Canadian video because apparently this author is Canadian, which I didn't even know until I was preparing that one. So bonus points there if anyone's looking for a Canadian lit read. Now switching over to fantasy, let's do this all again. Starting at the number 5 spot, we have Night Shadow by Sebastian de Castell. This is a trilogy that I started last year, and the first book, Traitor's Blade, ended up as a favorite of the year, and so not surprisingly, its sequel is currently hovering among my favorites. This is one that I describe as a Musketeers type retelling, where you have a group of individuals that once were protecting the king. They have become disgraced and now have to group together, at least in the first book, and kind of come together again as a brotherhood. So this is one I recommend to anyone who loves stories that are about friendship, particularly that male focused friendship, which for whatever reason, even as a woman, I really enjoy. I think it's really important to have those narratives the same way that I love stories that are focused around female friendship. I think everyone needs to have the stories that really speak to them. And I think that this one just really rings true, at least from my outsider perspective there. But regardless, it has some great witty banter, some really interesting fight scenes, because again, there is the back and forth in terms of the close combat, since they're fighting with their weapons, and so you have that aspect to it. And I'm not normally someone who is drawn into combat, but it's almost again that dancing aspect when you get the closer blades, and so you get to see what that looks like. I also enjoyed that this one has some nice close quarters combat with the blades, and I'm not normally someone who enjoys fight scenes, but again, because it almost feels like more of a dance and how a lot of times it's presented, I find that enjoyable. And on top of that, for a second book, it's solid. It doesn't feel like it's rehashing the first, but really adds onto the story without that second book slump. Really enjoying this series, and definitely need to round it out with the final book in the trilogy, although I'm going to be pretty sad when it's all said and done and I'm out of books in the Greycoat series to read. Then at the number 4 spot, we have The Witchwood Crown by Tad Williams. This is the first book in a sequel or companion series that follows after the events of the Dragonbone Chair, also of course by Tad Williams. And I don't want to spoil too much of the setup here, but it's set after the fact, and we follow individuals that are involved with ruling this nation. However, there is some kind of crisis looming. You have individuals who have disappeared, and there just seems to be something building, and of course there is more to that. This is one where just from the first page to the first chapter, I was really drawn in. I found characters that are immediately likable, or at least specifically the kind of characters that you'll immediately attach to, even if they again might have their own complexities, their own moral code. And I just was really pulled in. It is more traditional fantasy, but there's something about Tad Williams' writing that is just so engrossing. It really has some beautiful prose that it makes someone like me, who always totes the fact that I love innovative, out of the box, new modern fantasy, come back and really appreciate the classics too. So highly recommend this one. I do recommend reading the first trilogy, which might make an appearance in a couple minutes, so stay tuned. Then at number 3, we have Acacia by David Anthony Durham, and this is one that is a piece of epic fantasy, very loosely inspired by some histories of various Asian nations. Within the story, there is a nation that has long been at peace. However, when there is a passing of a ruler and things have to turn over in the ruling body, there is of course unrest and potentially people vying for the throne. This is one that has been on my radar for years. I feel like I've heard about it in some spaces, but it also feels kind of underhyped in certain quarters of booktube where I live. I just don't see a lot of people talking about it more regularly where I tend to watch my videos, and so this is one that I really enjoyed. It gave me very loose feels related to something like A Song of Ice and Fire, where again you have people vying for power, vying for the throne. I am someone who is always drawn to anything, even loosely pulling from various Asian cultures. I can't really speak to the details or accuracy, but as someone more from a Western perspective, it certainly drew that appeal, and I really want to see more from this. I said before that there is a series that comes after this, and I still, as of the time of recording this, have not continued on. Yell at me in the comments. I love this book. I don't know why I haven't kept reading, so please remind me that I should have done that a while ago, because that's what I said in my review video, and I'm saying it again. Really enjoy this one, and again, I think it's one that's a little bit more underhyped if you're looking for something that isn't all over everyone's best fantasy of all time list. It's definitely one that I think deserves more attention than it's getting. Then at number 2, we have City of Stairs by Robert Jackson Bennett, the first book in a trilogy, another series that I need to continue on with. This is one that is set in a city that used to be very powerful because it had the powers of these gods. However, those entities, those divine beings have been now killed, and the city has fallen from that great powerful place. In the story, we follow the perspective of this diplomat who gets pulled into this investigation and mystery when someone is killed, and the story goes on from there. This is one that is completely up my alley. It is quieter, character focused, and particularly set around this city rather than a huge epic fantasy set over numbers of perspectives and nations. This one is much more narrow in focus, and I really like that metropolitan aspect of fantasy. While it's still set in a secondary world, this is not what people normally describe as urban fantasy, but technically set around this city, and you have a story where there is a particular vibe or feeling of the city itself that almost becomes a character in this one. You have a lot of political maneuvering, characters trying to sort out and again strengthen their position, and there is again that mystery at the center of the story, which is something I love. I am someone who used to be a diehard mystery reader well before I got into, say, horror, and so my roots are really in mysteries, and so I love stories that play with the genres I read more now, but still have their roots in that question of who done it, what is happening, and that intrigue is always what keeps me turning the pages. Highly recommend this one, and again, yell at me in the comments to get going with the rest of this trilogy because I'm really excited to do so as soon as I'm talking about it on camera, and then I completely forget it and pick up other books as soon as I'm off camera. So keep reminding me in the comments until I get it done and continue on. And finally, at the #1 spot for Backlist Fantasy, we have The Dragonbone Chair by Tad Williams and its sequels in the original trilogy. As I mentioned, I really enjoyed the sequel trilogy, but I enjoyed the original even more. This is one that is a piece of epic fantasy. It is set in a nation that has had peace, and now as the ruler is dying. This seems to be a familiar plot as I talk about these books, but with that leader passing, it means that there is uncertainty in the lands, and we follow the story primarily from, at the beginning, one perspective of this young kitchen boy who gets sent off in a quest, and the story goes from there. You have someone who is forced to perhaps fulfill a bigger destiny and do something great. This is a more traditional novel, so it does have what you see as those familiar tropes, but of course you have to recognize that it was doing those tropes well before those tropes became hashed and rehashed over the years. And what I love so much is the fact that it is so well done that even if you're someone like me who is typically more drawn to more modern out-of-the-box fantasy these days, there's something to be appreciated about a classic book that is just doing everything so well. So you have characters that are well drawn, they feel like real people, they have flaws, they have insecurities, and that all plays into the story. You have this interesting world, this plot, and everything is just engrossing. The writing itself is beautiful. I can definitely see where George R. R. Martin got some of his inspiration for A Song of Ice and Fire, and I do want to preface that this one is not grimdark as is his books, but you can see slices of the story, little bits of the plot, the narrative, and again, even just the writing style. If you're someone who just loves how George R. R. Martin writes his epic fantasy, you will see threads of that with Tad Williams. Clearly it's a time where an author appreciated another one, as he has spoken about, and you can see where that inspiration comes from, which is just another layer on top of a story that completely stands on its own, even if you're not someone who is a diehard Song of Ice and Fire fan like I am. So highly recommend, if you are a fan of epic fantasy, this is one of the greats. I do recommend it. I do think it's one that if you are someone who is looking to read through all the big buzzy books in the genre, it's definitely not one you want to ignore. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And of course, I would love to know what is your favorite backlist science fiction fantasy that you've read so far this year. Again, my definition is anything published before the current year, so anything before 2025 counts for this video. And so I'd love to hear your comments down below. If you are new to my channel and do want to stick around, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell if you want to hear more from me. Give me a thumbs up if I deserved it today, and you can again drop a comment, even if just an emoji. It really helps me out with the algorithm. Thank you so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.